I put him in Canvas in between the page. Yeah. Okay. Okay, good morning. I have brought some slide handouts in if you would like one. I saw some of you already did have them printed out, but these are available if you want them. And this, we will spend most of the time today on contraception after we finish embryonic development. There's something I wanted to write up here on the board and have you make a note of and kind of get prepared for as you get ready for the next couple tests. So this would apply both for lecture tests next week and then the lab exam too the following week. And that is the difference between these words, which have a similar spelling and a lot of the same letters, but they are very different structures. And that's uterus, ureter, and urethra. And so make sure that you, when you're writing down one of those words, that you are choosing the right option and not mixing them up, because they all start with U and they all have a T and they all have a R and similar but different. So as you're studying, make sure you know those apart, because I've had that happen a lot, and sometimes it's hilarious, like what kind of sentence the person writes about men's uterus are way longer than women's. Like, no, you're talking about the wrong word. So make a note of how these are spelled and just pay attention to that as you're studying, that you're talking about what you think you're talking about. So last time, as we were talking about embryonic development and early development of an embryo, we had come to this slide and there are a lot of definitions on here. And as a rule, as an instructor, I am not huge on having you memorize definitions, but this stuff is worth knowing, like exactly what does that mean and exactly when does that stage start. So one of the things I will want you to know on next week's lecture exam is these type of definitions. And something that also is coming up on next week's lecture exam is a concept of timeline. So one of the things I will want you to do on that exam is I list down a certain number of things that happen during pregnancy, fetal development, and so on, and have you put them in order. Not so much always a memorization of like this week is this, but knowing the order of how things happen is pretty important. So that timeline is going to start from last menstrual period and be going until what we call a full term birth. So as we're going through these topics and talking about what happens when anything that has a time associated with, you'll want to study those, like what comes first, second, third, how do these events relate to each other in time? And one of those events would be the formation of the zygote. And remember that what the zygote is sperm fertilizes egg, and it's the first new cell of the new individual. And that happens pretty early on. That's going to happen. Is that before or after ovulation? After. Like you need ovulation of an oocyte before you can have a zygote. And ovulation of the oocyte would happen after the last menstrual period that the woman remembers that she had. So we looked at last time the timing of some of these early events. That was way back. Okay, so we've got zygote, and then we get to a stage called blastocyst, And the blastocyst is supposed to implant in the uterine wall, and hopefully that's in a good spot and not an ectopic spot. But when the zygote does implant, that is what the definition of pregnancy is. And this was strange to me when I first learned this concept, because like I had kind of thought, okay, when you have fertilization, you're pregnant. You have a new cell combo, you have a new being. But because we cannot detect that a person is pregnant until implantation and until the hormone surge, the medical definition of pregnant is there's been an implantation. That's an important definition to know also. So pregnancy is when the embryo implants, and that's usually around a week after fertilization, and that's usually around 3 weeks after the last menstrual period. So that's when we can start to tell someone is pregnant. The time up before that is the mystery time. We can't detect it in the individual yet. And then a lot of these dates are coming from this concept of last menstrual period. And this was also something that I had not thought about much until I actually got pregnant. And you go in for your first checkup to have your ultrasound, and they will ask you, when was your last menstrual period? And I'm like, well, let me think about that. And the reason they're asking that is because that is actually, at this point, the most reliable date that can be determined that relates to all of this. There could be the option to ask, well, when did you have sex? When did you think that you conceived? That could have been multiple times, but asking when was your last menstrual period, that's a way to determine what's day 0. So this is kind of a reliable, in some ways, reliable way to determine what was day 0. And you know, throughout history, that's when, okay, like we can say probably that was your last menstrual period. That was day 0. Probably ovulation was about 2 weeks later. Probably implantation was about 3 weeks later. And so that's why we date pregnancy weeks the way that we do. So from last menstrual period all the way to a full-term birth is usually about 40 weeks. That's how long pregnancy lasts. About 40 weeks. And we divide those stages of pregnancy into different ways. So one way that you can divide pregnancy is to talk about from the embryo, fetus, newborn perspective. And so there is the mystery time. This is what I'm calling mystery time. It's literally called pre-embryonic. So from the time that you have last menstrual period, there was ovulation, there was fertilization, there was a zygote. That mystery time, that's called pre-embryonic. And that's the part that's a little bit invisible and hard to literally detect. And then once you have implantation and you can detect the hormones from it, that's called embryonic stage. So embryonic stage of pregnancy would be, you know, from 3 to 8 weeks. Up until then, it's called pre-embryonic. And then the rest of the time from the new being's perspective, it is called fetal stage, which should be the next pop-up. From the 9th week until birth. And a lot of like general public people will call baby the whole time. baby's not actually a medical word, like even after it's born, it's the neonate. Or they might call it fetus if they have a little bit more medical background, but these are the medical terms. So you've got 3 to 8 weeks is embryo, fetus is 9 until birth, which can happen at different times depending on how the pregnancy goes. So those stages and definitions are useful to know. One of the next big, wait a minute, do I have? No, it's coming next. One of the next big milestones that you get to is a stage called viability. So we're kind of making a big jump in weeks here. We had kind of been focusing on the 8-9 weeks early development Carnegie stage stuff. Now we're jumping up to 23 weeks pregnant. And in the US, if you are in kind of a big city and you go into labor about 23 weeks into pregnancy, the newborn, when it's born, they will try to save it, and they will put it into neonatal intensive care and give support so that the newborn now will have a chance at living. If you're before 23 weeks, say if you're 22 weeks and you are in New York Metro, they might try. Or if you're in Houston Metro or you're in San Francisco or LA, 22 weeks, they might try. But if you're in Southwest Virginia and you're 22 weeks, they may not be able to save the newborn at that point. So that's the critical stage, viability. And viability really is when does that newborn have a good chance at surviving? At 23 weeks, and this is a few years outdated now, but newborns that were born at 23 weeks have about a 50-50 shot of living and surviving to become, healthy grown up. And then if they do survive, they might have some kind of handicap because they weren't finished developing. So your question last week, like, when are they finished developing? It's actually not at 23 weeks. That's the time when you can get, we have the medical technology available in big hospitals to support their development after they're born. Most US hospitals, if the birth is before 22 weeks, they will call the chaplain, not the emergency NICU team. They'll call the chaplain, and that would be considered stillbirth. There's certain cutoff point between miscarriage and stillbirth, but once you get past that point, 23, 22 weeks, good chance, much better chances for survival if they're born too early. One thing that was interesting to me is that some countries, and this might be outdated now, I think it's still true, like Great Britain, UK, they make a match between what is the age of viability and what is the stage that you can still get an abortion up to that point, which makes some conceptual sense. Like, well, if you don't want the baby, once it gets to a certain point where it could survive outside the womb, you shouldn't have an abortion after that. I haven't looked for other countries, but they kind of line up what's the age of viability. And if it can live outside the mom, it can live outside the mom, which is a different way to think about when should that limit be. Full-term pregnancy should be 40 weeks. If you are past 40 weeks, if you've heard of people like, that baby's overdue, you've been pregnant more than 40 weeks and still hasn't been born, how long can you be overdue before someone's going to make you have that baby? There have been people go 45. It's not medically suggested because the placenta will break down, but usually at 42, your OB, your obstetrician will insist that you be induced, and start drugs to force labor to happen because the placenta will start to break down if you wait too long. If pregnancy proceeds for 37 weeks and then the fetus is born and becomes a neonate, that's considered not premature. If they're born between 23 and 37, that's a premature birth. And the longer that the fetus can stay in the womb and develop, the better. They will have better health outcomes if they can stay inside the uterus and continue developing inside the mom as long as possible. And then our last section of definition on this page is trimester. I'm gonna draw that in here in a different color. So you may have heard this terminology. It's kind of dividing the pregnancy into thirds. First, second, third trimester. And that would go to about 13 weeks of pregnancy for the first trimester. I'm not lining this up very correctly with the bottom. Don't let that phase you. Like, trimesters are going to be in thirds. And then the second trimester is around 27 weeks, up until 27 weeks. And then the third trimester is 27 to 40, or however long the mom makes it before birth. Some countries have their abortion regulations line up with first trimester. Trimester is kind of a, like, let's arbitrarily divide pregnancy into thirds and just say first third, second third, and so on. This timeline, like embryo versus fetus, that's more of a defining line. Like, when does a new phase of development start? And I think I have a perception that talking about 6-week abortion ban has to do with, can you detect electrical activity of the heart? That seems to be like why that has been picked out as a certain timeline. There's not a heart with 4 chambers, but you can detect the electrical signal of their cells firing. And that's kind of a milestone that you can detect from the outside with the ultrasound. So back to, okay, what if the fetus is born early and now we have a premature infant? This particular acronym stands for Neonatal Intensive Care Unit, or people call it NICU. And at any given time in any local hospital, there's a certain number of babies in NICU, and they tend to need support in these different organ systems. The earlier they're born, the more support that they need. So some of the things that have to be monitored on the babies is, number one, they're not going to be able to breathe well. So I want to maybe erase this timeline and talk about what is not developed yet in these different systems. So some of the major issues that they will need support with is lung function. If they're born too early, their lungs don't have the proper fluids on the inside of the alveoli. So we're supposed to have some fluid very thin on the inside surface of our air sacs that let the air sacs stay open and not collapse. And that doesn't usually develop until late in pregnancy. So very premature infants will need breathing support, and they will have like tiny respirator masks. And it looks scary when you see it until you get used to it. They also have immature gut development. And they may not be ready for what I'm gonna call oral nutrition. So babies that are born very prematurely will first have kind of IV nutrition. And then they can start to be fed kind of by a tube. And they will hopefully have breast milk is the best for them when they get ready to handle that. But they will have to have some digestive assistance, and it might have to be an IV at first. The other, those are kind of the things that you see on a NICU infant. They're going to have breathing support, and they might have IV tubes, or they might have a feeding tube until their gut matures. They tend to look terrible. But I remember really well my first friend that had a NICU baby, and now that it's social media, like you see their, like put a picture, and I remember just being like, oh no. That's the first time I'd seen how a really preemie looks, and they kind of have that baby bird look, like they're super skinny and their eyes are bulging out and they're red. They don't have fat laid down, and they just look terrible. If you have a premature baby, or your friend does, or it's your niece or so on, that's normal, and they're not going to look like that forever. They're like eventually put on weight, and will look fine, but it can be kind of alarming in the beginning. A lot of times their eyes didn't develop as well, and they'll need tiny glasses, which have come a long way since I was a kid. Like now you have cool tiny glasses for tiny children, mini glasses. One thing that is different about fetal circulation before fetus is born and becomes a newborn is that because the placenta is doing so much for them, they, in utero, before they're born, do not need the liver and the lungs to be operating before they are born. Which makes sense. Like they don't need to breathe because the blood gases are taken care of by the mom. And there's no air for them to breathe in there anyway. They don't need to breathe. They also don't need their liver to balance their nutrition for them. So remember how the liver does all those nutrient interconversions and can turn carbs into fats and fats into carbs and so on. The fetus doesn't need that. The mom's doing all that. The mom's liver is doing all that. The mom's blood has all the balanced nutrition. And so fetal blood does not need to go through the liver and does not need to go through the lungs. And because of that, they have a different blood flow before they're born. And this is pretty cool. So the blood is going to come in, come through the umbilical vein, and it's got a lot of oxygen. It's got all the nutrients that it needs. And it's going to kind of run up past the liver and go past the liver because it's already got the nutrients and go into the vena cava. So the baby's or the fetus's umbilical cord has got blood with everything it needs. And here it comes, and it goes past the liver and joins in with the inferior vena cava. And it's got oxygen in it already from the mom. And then the blood comes up toward the heart, and it's already got oxygen. It doesn't need to go to the lungs. And it goes through a hole from the right atrium to the left atrium. You see this purple arrow? The blood doesn't have to go to the lungs to pick up oxygen because There is no oxygen in the lungs, and it already has oxygen from the mom. So there's a hole in the heart between the atria, and it's called foramen ovale. Foramen ovale. It's a hole between the atria. And the blood goes from right side over to the left side. Left side of the fetal heart pumps it out to the rest of their body. And it bypasses the lungs, which is interesting. So we are all born with a hole in our heart. It's a normal part of fetal development. And we are all born with blood bypassing the liver, because we don't need the liver to do anything with the blood yet. And then when you're born, when a new infant is born and they cut the cord, sometimes dad cuts the cord. Sometimes if it's a single mom, she can reach down and cut her own cord. There you go. Like, and then there's no more from the mom. Cut off, literally. That's a big shock. And there's going to have to be a lot of quick changes in this system for the newborn now to live on its own. So the umbilical cord structure kind of deteriorates, and now blood is going to come into the liver from the digestive system as normal. And their liver will start operating kind of slowly. Takes a while. And poor thing, this is the worst. Like, think about, you suddenly are running out of oxygen. Someone cut your cord. You run out of oxygen, and then your brain senses it. You get distressed, and your brain signals to contract your diaphragm. And they take this first, like, shuddery little breath, and then they usually scream because they're so like, and they have their first cry, and then from that point, the blood will start, like, that makes all these pressure changes. It makes blood start coming over into the lungs suddenly, and they will start breathing and oxygenating themselves, hopefully, and that hole is supposed to close. It's supposed to close in the first few days or weeks after birth, and then it becomes this structure called fossa ovalis. And it's a hole that you used to have between the sides of the heart. Sometimes that hole does not close, and they will have to have a tiny surgery at some point to help it close, so that they don't have blood swishing back and forth between their atria, and the blood will go the way it's supposed to. Those of you going into nursing or PA school, you'll need to look over this real carefully more in the future, but we're all born with a hole in our heart because our mom's blood was bringing us everything through the umbilical cord, and we didn't need the liver and the lungs to start working until we were born, which is cool. The mom doesn't, well, mom doesn't feel it. There are not nerves going over to the infant. So they don't feel it, but they're gonna feel distress that, like, suddenly no oxygen. But they don't feel that. That doesn't add on to the Did you have your hand up?
Yeah, so is it possible for them to like breathe and then not cry?
It's probably happened. Like, one thing that I read after I'd been a new parent for a while is, like, the newborn's only communication that they have about anything is crying. Like, every problem that they have, all they can do to signal is cry about it. But I'm sure that there have been babies that have breathed and have not cried. But that would be weird. But I bet it's happened. I bet if you found, like, an old nurse about to retire, they might tell you about one. But sometimes if you don't hear them cry, then you start checking, like, what's wrong with you? What's going wrong?
Some doctors like patting you.
Like, they used to show in movies that if they didn't cry, they'd slap them on the butt. I don't know if that is actually a clinical thing or not. And it's the nurse, actually. Like, it's hardly ever the doctor that's doing this stuff. That's shocking. Like, when you have a baby, how little the doctor is there. They don't sit in there with you. Even really, the nurses don't stay in there with you. Like, to come check once in a while. This is, I think, the last slide in this section, and this is not like a discussion that we're going to have, but these are questions that are important to think about when you think about what you think about abortion and who should have one and when should it be. And then this one is not really, this is kind of going into a new topic, but knowing, now that we've looked at some of those facts and how development proceeds and how do we define pregnancy, that kind of relates to, okay, what kind of contraceptive would be best for a couple based on what they think about some of these things? And what do we, like, does a contraceptive cause an abortion or not? That's actually like a very clear-cut question, and the answers to that are known scientifically, but there's a lot of sometimes public confusion about, does a certain contraceptive end a pregnancy or does it not end a pregnancy? So that's kind of leading into what we're going to look at next, which is contraceptives. And if you came in late, there's some handouts laying around different spots that have these slides. So switch over to that. And I've got a slide that you don't have. So this is a picture of one of my great grandmas. We called her Grandma Rock. Her name is Ruby Rock. And this is her in the hat, probably like around 1960, and her husband. And then these are all of their kids. So this is Barbara Jean, and she was getting married. And this is my Nana. So they had 4 girls and 10 boys. And out of those 14, 13 of them lived, to be grown up, which is pretty good for those days. And you may have similar pictures in your family albums of, big families with so many kids back then. Or you may have family members that have a lot of kids now. And this is kind of, I always marvel at this and about this story. She made 100 biscuits every morning for like 20 years, every day. So many kids. And having contraceptives has changed the world for women being able to do other things besides take care of kids. Not that there's anything like it's super noble and important to take care of your kids, but like if I think about my own life, if I didn't have contraceptives in my life, I wouldn't be able to do this job. Like I couldn't afford the daycare. I think you need to helpful to stay home with the kids a little bit. I wouldn't be able to do this job if I had to take, maternity leave every year and have daycare for all that many kids. So we kind of tend to take it for granted that, like, yeah, contraceptives are a thing and they change the world for women. But I always think about that when I get to this, like, I am able to do this job because of birth control. Because I have 3 kids, which now is like kind of a lot, but it's not 14. So when we think about what birth control is, it's a little bit wider than what you might think of as like, oh, you go buy something and then blah, blah, blah. So using or practicing birth control in its simplest sense is kind of making a decision about how many kids and when. You think about how things used to be, that was kind of difficult, and you don't know. Like, think about when. So maybe this is like dorky or callous, but 2 of our boys, like, we think, oh, it'd be helpful if they were born in the summer, because then I could teach, be ready to teach again in the fall. Maybe that's kind of like, oh, that's cold. Well, that was helpful and it worked out. And then Joseph is kind of like, yeah, I think we want to have 3 kids, so we've already got 2 little kids, so let's just go ahead and have a 3rd little kid. And those were some fun years. But even the ability to think about, okay, I think I want to have kids at this time and not just any surprise time, that's dependent on birth control. And there are a lot of different methods to do that planning or to do that choosing. And the methods to get there are called contraception. So birth control is more of like an idea and a philosophy, and contraception is how you get there. And all the different contraceptive methods are either going to like not have fertilization, so you don't get fertilization, and most of them do this. And there's a few that might allow fertilization, but then prevent implantation. And that's the set that tend to be maybe controversial. So if I've erased my timeline, but that mystery time of the pre-embryonic period, which is basically before implantation, that embryo before it implants, it is a type of life. It is a new being. And like whether that persists or not, and whether the contraception ends that being or not, those methods, some people would not want to use those if their view is that life begins at conception and the mystery time is important to protect. You would not want to use methods that let this happen and then block fertilization. That makes sense? Sorry, you would not want to use a method that allows fertilization and then blocks implantation. So knowing the difference between those is important to know. So just to quickly review, natural conception is going to happen. We have normally sperm in the vagina. They go through the cervix. They travel up through the uterus. They kind of split between the 2 fallopian tubes, and they're going to meet the oocyte, usually in the fallopian tube. So there's a lot of places that you could prevent that, let's say. This, I actually meant to print this out huge for you so that you can read it. This is super helpful. And we're going to keep kind of coming back to it during this section. And what it is a chart of contraceptive failure rates. And I feel like, I don't know, do you all look at this in high school? Do you learn anything about contraceptives in high school besides condoms for STD purposes? I understand why. Because I don't know, like I like being a college teacher. So what this is showing, okay, in a year, see how it says there, first year of use. This is measuring if a couple is having fairly regular sex for a year and they are using that method, how many out of 100 would get pregnant within a year? And that's how they determine these failure rates. So if you do nothing, like you're not using any method, and I don't know, like you're not doing any method in particular, 85 out of 100 couples in a year would achieve pregnancy. And actually, we define infertility as failure to conceive after 1 year of unprotected sex. That is what the definition of infertility is. And that's the definition if the woman is 35 or younger. If you're older than 35, it's 6 months, but that's like a different category. So this is for people, women under 35. So in a year, if you're not infertile, it's likely that you would achieve pregnancy. And remember, about half the blastocysts at least don't implant and they just keep drifting and we don't know it. So that's why it normally would take, around a year. If it's been a year and you want to have a child and you haven't, then you should seek medical help. So then we look at these columns, perfect use versus typical use. And notice if you're not using any method, those are the same because you're not using anything anyway. You're just living your life. But notice, let's go down to male condom, because that's probably what people have heard the most of about contraceptives. Perfect use, 2 out of 100 couples in a year would have a pregnancy they weren't planning for. Typical use is 18%. This is important to know. So 2% would be like, you get it on, it's the right fit, it didn't tear, you put it on early enough, it stayed on, it didn't slip, everything went right. Mm-hmm.
Sorry, I'm still.
Mm-hmm. Perfect is you use that method exactly how you're supposed to and exactly according to the instructions. In like you're using it scientifically and you get everything right. Typical use is like when you look at people that say that they use that, what is their actual failure rate? What's the pregnancy rate? So like for male condom, the typical use failure rate is way higher because of things like you didn't have it on from the start. It was too big or too small. It was too old and it had a rip in it and you didn't know. It ripped during. I don't know, what are the other things? It was manufactured badly. Like you want the FDA regulating this kind of stuff. That's happened in other countries, like it's condom, buy it, manufactured badly. So the typical use is like what people tend to actually do, how it actually comes out. If you are not being super strict about using the thing perfectly. So I don't know, like how good are the people at actually following the directions, actually following through versus what tends to actually happen. So that's what the difference between these two columns. We're going to be kind of going through certain of these methods, but they fall into 4 groups or 4 classifications, which are behavior or behavioral. What's the next one? There is some kind of barrier. There is a hormonal change, or there is a surgical method. So, and those are kind of the big categories of how contraceptives fall into. Behavior, that's going to be something that requires no equipment. You change your behavior. You don't need like to purchase an object to do that. The behavioral change. So we'll look at these different categories and what are the major ones that fall into each category. So we'll start with behavioral. And there's 3. The first behavioral method to prevent pregnancy is literally abstinence all the time. And I know that if you're from around here, you've probably heard a lot about that. And it's obvious how that works. That is a behavioral method. Number 1, literal abstinence constantly. Number 2 is something called, it can have different names, but it's called fertility awareness method. And this is a like a periodic, that's kind of like funny and ironic, a periodic abstinence that you avoid having sex around when ovulation happens. So this is based on, okay, let's not have sperm in the vicinity when the egg is in the vicinity. And if you have a regular cycle and you track it carefully, and you know when ovulation tends to be, this can have a pretty good success rate. It's key to know when you ovulate if you're using this method. And this method, I have it like a silly thing I want to show you right now. Okay. So this method, I tend to spend more time on because this is two sides of a coin. So you can use this method, I'm bad at this, to not get pregnant. You can use this method to get pregnant. So the flip side of using this to not get pregnant is to know when you ovulate and have more sex around that time. And people who are trying to conceive, they tend to be doing something around this, even if they don't know what it's called. So knowing how this works is useful in both situations. Being on a regular cycle is pretty important to this if you're going to use it for contraception. Because you've got to calculate, okay, when am I going to ovulate and avoid sperm in the vicinity during that time? These days, you can buy ovulation kit to check your hormones, tell you when you ovulate. There's apps that do reasonable at this. I would not use a Fitbit for this. I'm not impressed with that part of my Fitbit. It also can't really tell whether I'm sleeping or if I'm just reading a book in bed. But there's other apps that can help you tell this. And then there's also stuff that changes about cervical mucus, and even your body temperature goes up and down around ovulation. So those things together can help do this method. And if I don't know who's Catholic, or if you know people who are Catholic, doing this is actually okay with the Catholic Church as a way to regulate number of children, which makes this very valuable to Catholics who actually follow the teachings of the church. It's also really valuable for people trying to get pregnant. And like, if I'm going to make any endorsement in this class, it's for this book right here. It's good. Okay. Next behavioral method is called withdrawal method. This is the one people tend to describe it as pulling out. So this requires a lot of control of behavior. So be able to feel when the male is about to ejaculate, and this is all on him, completely male dependent. And then do not ejaculate into the vagina. And that is going to greatly reduce the number of sperm that have a chance to fertilize. So we're not going to have a class discussion about challenges, but this requires a lot of willpower. If you're the female, you have no control over this. You got to have a lot of trust. And then you hope that there's not too many sperm in the pre-ejaculate from the bulbourethral gland. So I have a space on here. Something I want you all to do is to go back to this chart and write down what are the failure rates of that method onto each one of these. So for fertility awareness, like these are different subversions of that. So standard day, 2-day ovulation, symptothermal, they're around 4% failure rate if you are doing it perfectly. And they didn't put on here who's doing it imperfectly, like what the typical failure rate, which is interesting. So we don't know. But if you do it super scientifically, it's pretty good method. If you do withdrawal very strictly, it can be a pretty good method. And 1 out of 25 couples would have a failure, have a pregnancy using withdrawal in a perfect use. But the typical use, it's 1 in 5 couples would have a pregnancy. Mm-hmm.
So for failure rates, you want to put the first.
I think perfect use. I don't want to have you, because I think kind of you get the picture now of like how much worse the typical use tends to be. And so one of the things I want you to know about the methods is it low, medium, or high failure rate? kind of generally. So, as far as what you write down, you can write down what's the perfect use. Yeah, good question. Okay, so fertility awareness method would be around, let's say 4% failure rate. Withdrawal is 4% failure rate if you do it perfect, but most people don't. That one's a big difference between, you can mess that up. You can mess that up. So those, you don't have to buy anything. You don't have to have access to contraceptives to use those. So that's an advantage. They're cheap. Anybody could do that. It requires some behavioral decisions and following through, let's say. So then we get to barrier methods. All the different barriers, no matter what style they are blocking sperm. So they are trying to stop sperm from going past where the block is. And condoms are typical, the most popular example of that. There are female condoms, which are not popular, but they exist. And so a note to make about condoms is that out of all of these, condoms, let's not right, stop. Condoms can reduce STD transmission. And I think that's probably why if you learned about birth control in public school, they emphasize condoms because they're also trying to teach you how to not get STDs. So condoms block both pregnancy and STDs pretty well. These other methods are not going to block STDs. In fact, they can make them worse. They can make them worse. So for STD prevention, condoms are what you need. But there are other ways to block sperm, and condoms tend to be the male chosen birth control choice at this time. There are female condoms, they're not popular. There are structures called diaphragms and cervical caps, which are female barrier structures. And what these do, diaphragm is going to cover, or let's say a diaphragm is going to block the vagina. I'm trying to think how to describe it. We need our picture. Here we go. Okay, so a diaphragm, you know those big giant frisbees that are like this big and they're kind of flexible and you can throw it, they're like this big and they got a wire, they're kind of like stiff on the outside and flexible on the inside. That's what a diaphragm is like, and it actually, you insert it and it blocks the vagina. You kind of fold it, put it in, blocks the vagina, and it's not like, it needs to be fitted, but it blocks the vagina. A cervical cap covers and blocks the cervix. So it's similar, but it's smaller, and it goes up higher, and it's like a little hat for your cervix, like a beanie for your cervix. And notice on those where they are found. So where did that go? Okay, there's diaphragm. They don't have cervical cap, but there's diaphragm. And 6% failure rate, perfect, 12 typical. Cervical cap is kind of similar. And those actually, you got this definition here, paris and nulliparous women. Paris means you've had a baby already. Nulliparous means you have not ever had a vaginal birth. That's actually what it means. You had a baby come out of your vagina at some point, and it does stretch it a little bit. So in women that have had a vaginal birth, these kind of things don't work as well because getting the fit right is difficult. And those have to be fitted by a doctor too. But they're barrier methods. And you can go in later and write down what the failure rates are for these. What? Oh, I need those. Maybe if I wait a minute. Or is it? It's almost time for class viewer. Let me try clicking it more slowly. Try reloading the whole thing. I like to have pictures to talk about this. And this is the wrong slide set. Try that one more time. I wonder what my great grandma would think. Bet she can see me from heaven. I wonder what she thinks about me saying all this stuff. There we go. Okay. So another type of barrier that's not a physical block, but it's a chemical blockade, is basically a category called spermicides. And these are sperm killers or sperm freezers or sperm chemicals that block sperm movement at the very least. And they can be used alone. They're not great because 200 million sperm, even if you get 90% of them, that's still a lot of sperm. So they tend to be used in conjunction with barriers. So there are certain condoms that have spermicide associated with them, as well as other barrier methods. So there's a contraceptive method that has become popular again in the last 15 years, that's called a sponge. And a sponge is, you can buy this at like a drugstore or probably Walmart. And it's kind of a barrier, and you insert it into the vagina, and it's spongy material, and inside the sponge is spermicide. So this doesn't have to fit amazing because it's got chemicals that also kill sperm with it. And that's a good over-the-counter, can be a good over-the-counter option, but you can't keep reusing it. It's a one-time thing. So it can get expensive. But that's listed here under, in the chart, sponge, as these two. And they work a lot better if you have not previously had a vaginal birth. If you have, they tend to not fit as well. But it is a pretty good option. So we're going to stop there, and next time continue with the hormonal and the surgical methods. And there will also be some new slides about pregnancy. So and it's kind of this level of info. It's like not hard to understand. Here's some pictures. Here's some things that happen. This is what it looks like. And then we will have lecture exam Wednesday. So have a great weekend. It's going to be really cold. Be a good time to study. Get a hot drink, get a blanket, study. I can't today because I got other stuff going on today, but Tuesday is a completely open lab day. So there's no new material on Tuesdays, and that's a good day. Were there certain models like?
It's just the one that's on top of I just wanted to do something new.
Yeah, for those, I would recommend to go to that lab page in Canvas and watch those videos because those models haven't changed. Like that model with the board that has the digestive system and the esophagus and stuff, that has not changed.